April 30th, 1943. The first light of dawn broke across the Andalusian coastline. Fishermen in small wooden boats rowed through the misty waters near Huelva, Spain. The sea was calm, but one of them noticed something unusual drifting among the swells. As he drew closer, the shape came into focus. A man, lifeless, floating face down. His uniform marked him as a British officer. A black briefcase was chained securely to his wrist. The fishermen towed the body ashore. Spanish authorities were summoned, and soon the corpse was brought under official custody. Word spread quickly among local officials, and within hours, the British vice-consul was notified. But Spain, though neutral on paper, leaned heavily toward Axis sympathies. It was almost inevitable that German intelligence officers stationed in Madrid would hear of the discovery. And they did. When the corpse was examined, papers tucked into the briefcase revealed what seemed to be a windfall for German espionage. Inside were confidential documents outlining Allied plans to strike Greece and Sardinia. If true, this was no ordinary drowning victim. It was a turning point in the war disguised as a tragedy. To most who witnessed the recovery that day, it was simply a bizarre accident of war. Bodies washed ashore from shipwrecks or air crashes were not uncommon. But behind this one lay the hand of deliberate calculation. Unbeknownst to the fishermen, to the Spanish authorities, and even to the Germans who would later inspect the find, the body was part of an elaborate British deception, an operation so audacious it bordered on the unbelievable. The Mediterranean in 1943 was a chessboard of strategy. With the defeat of Axis forces in North Africa, Allied commanders turned their eyes toward Europe's southern underbelly. Sicily was the obvious next target, but obviousness was dangerous. Hitler had fortified the island heavily, expecting an invasion. For the Allies to succeed, they would need to convince the German high command that their true intentions lay elsewhere. And so the question arose, how does one mislead an enemy as calculating as Adolf Hitler? The answer, devised in the shadowy offices of British intelligence, was as grim as it was ingenious. Use a corpse to tell a story the enemy desperately wanted to believe. The dead man retrieved at Huelva became known as Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. His uniform, his documents, even the love letters in his pockets told a tale of a living, breathing officer. Yet Major Martin had never existed. He was the centerpiece of an operation that would come to be called Mincemeat. One intelligence officer later reflected that the plan seemed more like the plot of a spy novel than a military strategy. But in 1943, Britain was fighting for survival, and deception had become as valuable as divisions of tanks. On that quiet morning, as Spanish officials prepared their reports and German agents prepared to act, a single question hung in the air. Would the enemy believe the lie? What began as a fisherman's discovery on a Spanish beach would soon ripple outward to Berlin, to Hitler's war councils, and to the battlefields of Sicily. The corpse in the waves was more than just a body, it was a weapon. And this was only the beginning. The discovery of the body in Spain was not a random accident. It was the climax of months of planning, born from a desperate problem facing the Allies in early 1943. The North African campaign had ended in Allied victory. Rommel's Africa Corps, once the terror of the desert, had been driven out. For Winston Churchill and his generals, the question was not whether to strike Europe, but where. The Mediterranean was the pathway, and Sicily, an island close to the Italian mainland, was the obvious stepping stone. Its ports offered control of sea lanes, its airfields provided dominance over the central Mediterranean, and its fall would likely force Mussolini's Italy to the brink of collapse. But obviousness was a curse. Hitler saw the danger too. Even before the Allies had completed their conquest of Tunisia, German divisions were pouring into Sicily. Panzer units, Luftwaffe squadrons, and artillery batteries transformed the island into a fortress. Any Allied invasion would mean horrendous losses, perhaps even failure. It was in this moment of uncertainty that Churchill reminded his commanders of a principle he cherished. In war, deception could be as powerful as force. He had long been fascinated with the idea of trickery and strategy. In wartime, he once remarked, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. The responsibility for carrying out those lies fell on an unusual collection of men and women, Britain's intelligence services. Within MI5, the 20 Committee, or XX Committee, specialized in running double agents and crafting deception operations. Their task was to make German intelligence believe what the Allies wanted them to believe. By 1943, this committee had become an indispensable part of the war effort, weaving a web of misinformation across Europe. It was within this culture of creative trickery that an extraordinary idea began to take shape. The seed of it lay in a peculiar document drafted back in 1939. Known as the Trout Memo, it had been written by Admiral John Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence, though many believed his brilliant young assistant, Ian Fleming, the future creator of James Bond, had contributed much of its flair. The memo compared deception in war to fishing. The trout fisher casts patiently, often for hours, with no results. Occasionally, however, he gets a sprat to catch a mackerel. Among its suggestions was one chilling line. Perhaps the enemy could be deceived by planting documents on a corpse. At the time, it was little more than a theoretical note, a curiosity in a list of dozens of ploys. But as the Allies stared down the heavily defended coast of Sicily, the idea resurfaced. Inside MI5 Section 17M, dedicated to counter-espionage and deception, the proposal gained momentum. Could they, in fact, create a false identity for a dead man, furnish him with documents, and ensure those papers fell into German hands? It sounded macabre, even grotesque. Yet the logic was impeccable. German intelligence trusted documents recovered in apparent accidents far more than rumors whispered by spies. A corpse, washed ashore under seemingly natural circumstances, might be the perfect delivery system for misinformation. The gamble was immense. If the Germans suspected the ruse, the consequences would be catastrophic. They would know Sicily was the true target, and the element of surprise would vanish. But if the deception worked, it could pull German divisions hundreds of miles away, leaving Sicily weakened and vulnerable. By spring of 1943, the Mediterranean had become a chessboard. Every move carried the weight of thousands of lives. The Allies prepared their fleets and armies for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, but behind the battle plans lay an invisible struggle of wits. British intelligence had to make Hitler believe a lie so convincing that he would risk his armies on it. That lie would soon be embodied in a single man, one who never lived, yet whose death would alter the course of the war. The idea of planting false documents on a corpse demanded more than a dead body. It demanded a man who had never lived. If the deception was to succeed, the Germans had to believe not just in the papers he carried, but in the very existence of the officer who bore them. Out of this grim necessity was born Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. The architects of this identity were two British intelligence officers, Charles Cholmondeley of MI5 and Ewan Montague of the Royal Navy. Both were members of the 20 Committee, the group tasked with weaving elaborate deception operations. For weeks, they immersed themselves in the strange business of creating a life from scratch. Montague later recalled that the smallest detail mattered more than the grand illusion. It is the trivialities, he explained, that give authenticity to a story. Thus began the careful construction of Major Martin's world. He was given a wallet containing theater ticket stubs, a silver cross, and a bill from his tailor. His pockets held ordinary things: keys, a pack of cigarettes, a book of stamps. Most crucial of all, he carried two personal letters, one from his father, written in affectionate but formal tones, and another from his supposed fiancée, a young woman named Pam. In truth, Pam was nothing more than a secretary in MI5, recruited to pen heartfelt love letters that spoke of longing, quarrels, and reconciliation. One read simply, "All my love, darling, Pam." The words, brief and personal, were designed to disarm suspicion. Beyond the pockets and papers, his identity was woven into the bureaucracy of war. His name was entered into Royal Marines lists, and false orders were typed on official stationery. Even his rank was carefully chosen. Major was high enough to justify carrying sensitive documents, but not so high as to invite excessive scrutiny. Yet for all this careful construction, one grim task remained. They needed a body. This part of the operation carried with it a somber weight. British officials turned quietly to medical authorities, seeking the remains of a man whose cause of death would not arouse suspicion when discovered at sea. After delicate negotiations, they were provided with the body of GLYNDWR Michael, a homeless man who had died from ingesting rat poison. In death, he would serve a cause larger than himself. Few would ever know his real name. History would remember him only as Major William Martin. Pathologists advised on how the body should be preserved and prepared. The sea would need to leave its natural marks, saltwater swelling and softening the flesh to mask the true cause of death. Every detail was managed. His uniform carefully pressed, his papers sealed, and a black attaché case chained securely to his wrist. Inside that case lay the deception's heart, letters between Allied generals that strongly implied the next invasions would strike Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. The strangeness of the undertaking was not lost on those involved. As Montague later reflected, they were crafting a human life out of fragments, all to serve as bait for Hitler's war machine. In the dimly lit offices of MI5, clerks and officers spoke of Major Martin as though he were real, where he might have dined, what football club he might have supported. The fiction became so detailed that even those constructing it occasionally caught themselves believing in him. By late spring of 1943, the man who never lived was complete. Major William Martin, Royal Marines, had a history, a family, a sweetheart, and a duty. He also had a secret that could change the fate of Europe. All that remained was to set him adrift. On April 19, 1943, the submarine HMS Seraph surfaced off the coast of southern Spain under a moonless sky. The waters of the Gulf of Cadiz were calm, the air heavy with the scent of salt. In the pre-dawn darkness, the crew assembled on deck for a duty unlike any other. Draped in a waterproof shroud, the body of Major William Martin was solemnly brought forth. A briefcase, chained to his wrist, glistened faintly in the dim light. The men knew they were not committing a fallen comrade to the sea, but setting a trap that might alter the fate of the Mediterranean. With a quiet prayer and a final push, the body slipped beneath the waves, drifting toward the Spanish coastline. For hours, the tide carried him silently, until, on April 30th, a local fisherman near Huelva spotted a corpse entangled in the surf. Authorities were alerted, and soon Spanish officials arrived to recover the body. The uniform was unmistakable, a British Royal Marine, complete with identity papers and the mysterious black attaché case still secured to his arm. To the Spanish authorities, neutral yet sympathetic to the Axis cause, this discovery was no accident of the sea, it was an opportunity. From there, the chain of deception moved as intended. The body and its possessions were examined, the case eventually opened. The documents it contained were carefully handled, letters between Allied commanders outlining supposed plans for a large-scale assault on Greece and Sardinia. Though returned to the British attaché in Madrid weeks later with formal courtesies, it was clear the seals had been broken. The information had already been photographed and shared with German agents. Inside the Abwehr, German military intelligence, excitement grew. Reports arrived in Berlin that a valuable British officer had drowned off Spain, carrying critical invasion plans. Analysts pored over the letters, cross-referencing dates, units, and locations. The details were consistent with known Allied operations in the Mediterranean. To many, it seemed too elaborate to be anything but authentic. German diaries and intercepted conversations reveal the eagerness with which the find was embraced. One Abwehr officer reportedly described it as a gift from the sea. Another noted that the specificity of the documents, down to brigade numbers and logistical planning, made them beyond the reach of ordinary deception. In a war of shadows, this looked like a shaft of light. Yet not all were convinced. Some within the German high command raised suspicions. Could the British really have been so careless as to lose such vital papers? Was it possible this was a ruse? The debate reached Hitler himself. Known for his mistrust of intelligence, he nonetheless leaned toward accepting the documents as genuine. His fixation on the Balkans as a critical theater of war, what Churchill once called Hitler's soft underbelly obsession, made him particularly receptive to the suggestion that Greece was the Allies' next target. The Germans began to act. Reinforcements were dispatched to Greece and Sardinia. Panzer divisions were shifted, defensive positions strengthened, and air reconnaissance in the eastern Mediterranean intensified. In Sicily, meanwhile, defenses remained, but crucial reserves that might have contested an invasion were withheld. Back in London, British intelligence waited anxiously for signs that their deception had taken root. Ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park soon confirmed their hopes. Intercepted German messages revealed troop movements toward Greece and heightened activity in Sardinia. The bait had been swallowed whole. For those who had conceived and executed the plan, the waiting had been nerve-wracking. One officer later recalled the sense of suspended breath in the weeks following the body's discovery. Every day we scanned the reports, asking ourselves, had they believed? Had we gone too far, or not far enough? The answer was becoming clear. The corpse that had drifted ashore at WWII was no longer just a body. He was a phantom officer whose presence on German desks was reshaping Hitler's strategic calculus. Major William Martin, who had never lived, had now entered enemy hands, and with him, the keys to victory in the Mediterranean. The documents had done their work. From Berlin to Athens, the German High Command became convinced that the Allies' next strike would fall not on Sicily, but on Greece and Sardinia. To Hitler, it confirmed his long-standing fear that the Balkans, rich in resources and a critical gateway to southern Europe, were the true target. His obsession blinded him to the obvious. Sicily, the natural stepping stone to Italy, was heavily reinforced at first, but now its defenses began to thin. In late May 1943, orders went out from the Führer's headquarters. Elite panzer divisions were transferred eastward, Luftwaffe squadrons redeployed, and defensive plans redrawn. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, was dispatched to Greece to oversee preparations for an invasion that would never arrive. His presence was a clear sign of German priorities. The Allies had, without firing a shot, forced Hitler to misallocate some of his most valuable commanders and forces. Meanwhile, in London, Allied intelligence tracked these movements with mounting relief. Ultra-intercepts confirmed the shift in German strategy, and planners of Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, saw the window of opportunity widen. For them, the stakes were enormous. The island was not only a fortress controlling Mediterranean sea lanes, but also the springboard into mainland Italy. Cracking it open was essential to toppling Mussolini and weakening the Axis from within. When the Allied fleet assembled in July 1943, it was one of the largest armadas the world had ever seen. More than 3,000 ships carried 160,000 troops across the sea, supported by vast air cover. On the night of July 9th, paratroopers descended through stormy skies, and amphibious landings began along the southern coast of Sicily. Resistance was stiff in places, but it was far lighter than Allied commanders had feared. The Germans had scattered their strength, preparing for phantom invasions elsewhere. Veterans recalled the moment with awe. One paratrooper later noted, "It was as if the enemy had been looking the wrong way. We found gaps where there should have been walls." The element of surprise, crafted not by guns but by deception, had spared countless Allied lives. Within weeks, Axis forces on the island crumbled under the combined weight of British, American, and Canadian troops. By August 17th, Sicily had fallen. The operation had cost lives, but far fewer than expected, and its political consequences were immediate. Just days after the invasion began, Benito Mussolini was deposed by his own council. Italy teetered on the brink of surrender, a development that would unravel Hitler's southern flank. For the Germans, the realization came too late. Troops sent to Greece and Sardinia remained idle, waiting for an invasion that never came. Rommel, once the master of desert warfare, stood in the wrong theater, his talents wasted on a shadow campaign. Hitler's miscalculation, rooted in his trust of the Major Martin documents, had shifted the balance of the Mediterranean campaign. Operation Husky was more than a military victory. It was proof that deception could alter the course of history as surely as any battlefield triumph. Operation Mincemeat had transformed a corpse into a weapon, and that weapon had forced the Führer into a blunder that reshaped the war. The Mediterranean, once dominated by Axis power, was now firmly in Allied hands, and the road to Rome, and eventually Berlin, lay open. The deception had worked beyond even its creators' hopes. And as the guns of Sicily fell silent, London spymasters knew the war of shadows was far from over. The next chapter of their struggle would be even more audacious. When the guns fell silent over Sicily and Mussolini's regime collapsed, the men and women who had devised Operation Mincemeat returned to their offices in London. For them, there was no fanfare, no medals pinned in public ceremonies. Their triumph, like so many victories of the intelligence war, was to remain invisible. The truth of what had happened off the coast of Spain in April 1943 was sealed under the Official Secrets Act, buried as deeply as the man who had unwittingly carried the burden of a nation's hopes. For decades, the world knew only the name Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. His identity had been carefully crafted, his personal effects preserved in the archives, his grave tended in Welva as that of a fallen British officer. In reality, he had never lived. Behind the uniform lay the tragic figure of WWII Michael, a homeless Welshman who had died in London after consuming rat poison. His death had been quiet and unnoticed, but through deception, he was reborn as a soldier whose influence reached the highest levels of the German command. It was not until the 1970s, when documents were declassified and memoirs published, that the story of Operation Mincemeat emerged in full. Even then, the details shocked many. That a single body could sway the movements of Panzer divisions, alter Hitler's calculations, and pave the way for the Allied conquest of Sicily seemed almost unbelievable. Yet the records proved it true. One historian would later write that mincemeat was the most successful strategic deception of the Second World War. Winston Churchill himself had long recognized the power of such methods. During the war, he praised the ingenuity of Britain's spymasters, calling deception the silent weapon of war. Unlike the thunder of artillery or the roar of bombers, deception struck without sound, reshaping battlefields through shadows and whispers. Operation Mincemeat stood as its most audacious example. The legacy of the ruse did not end in 1943. Lessons drawn from Mincemeat influenced Cold War intelligence operations, from double agents in Europe to elaborate disinformation campaigns waged by both NATO and the Soviet Union. The principle remained constant. In war, perception could be as powerful as firepower. Modern doctrines of military deception, psychological operations, and strategic misinformation trace their lineage to episodes like Mincemeat. But at the heart of this story lies a deeper reflection. The haunting image of a body washing ashore in Spain was not simply a clever trick. It was a reminder of the human cost of war. WWII Michael, a man forgotten in life, became central in death to a plan that saved thousands of others. Allied soldiers who stormed the beaches of Sicily owed their survival, in part, to a deception carried on the wrist of a corpse. Today, his grave in Welva still bears the inscription, WWII Michael, served as Major William Martin, Royal Marines. It is both epitaph and confession, an acknowledgement of the strange and poignant truth behind the illusion. Visitors leave flowers there, not only to honor a man, but to recognize the ingenuity and sacrifice that defined an era. Operation Mincemeat endures as one of the strangest tales of World War II, a reminder that wars are not won by strength alone, but by cunning, imagination, and the willingness to take risks that defy convention. It was proof that even in the darkest days of conflict, intelligence and deception could shift the fate of nations. And so the story comes full circle, back to that silent coastline in Spain where fishermen first discovered a lifeless form drifting in the waves. No shot was fired, no battle fought in that moment. Yet history itself was altered. In the end, it was a corpse that fooled Hitler, and in doing so, changed the course of the war.